Another thing that people have taken as a given that seems to be, that could possibly be a complete fabrication. It might be another offshoot of this Mason's plan to just siphon off a bunch of money from the space program, but also siphon a bunch of money from the nuclear weapons program, because it seems like, and this was only brought to my attention through you and your post about it and the footage that you've shown, it seems like at least the test footage that we've seen of a lot of nuclear weapons from back in the day when they're telling our parents to duck and cover under their school desk to protect them from a nuclear blast, and you got the air raid sirens going off. Obviously, our entire culture was completely paralyzed by the idea of nuclear weapons. But when you're looking at the test footage, given back then it might not have looked fake. You know, back then they actually thought King Kong looked real in the movie, or Jaws looked real in the movie, but now we can see it's clearly fake. When you look back at that footage, it's oftentimes, it looks like the scale of, say, a subdivision where you're in an empty lot across the street aiming a camera at a farmhouse on the other side of the street, a lot over, and then the blast hits and the farmhouse just gets destroyed. The house just gets ripped apart. But what happened to the camera? You know, who's filming that? The camera is only a couple 100 feet away from that. And in some videos, man, this is the most compelling, is the blast comes from behind the camera. What the hell is that? The blast comes from behind the camera and the house gets blown away out into the background of the shot. And you're like, what kind of camera in that day and age could survive that blast, but an entire building can't? I mean, it seems way out there. You've changed my mind on a little of this. You've dipped my needle further into the fringe for sure.
Do nuclear bombs exist? Your immediate answer is yes. But how do you know? During the mid-20th century, television and movie watchers were bombarded with imagery of what was purported to be atomic test footage. But what were they really watching? They couldn't rewind a videotape or rescan through a video on their computer. So what option did they have but to accept these images at their face value? Now we have opportunity to scrutinize these images to see if they hold up to analysis. Take a look at these trees. Now what was that? And who turned the camera? They're in awfully straight lines, aren't they? Now this must be a different blast because it's coming from a different direction. Wait, now they've put it back. But those are the same trees we saw in the first clip, aren't they? And now this. First they showed us these trees that they panned left on. Then they show us these trees that look like they should be next to a model train. Notice how straight the rows are. It looks artificial to me. Then they show us these trees again. Where's the forward camera? And then back to these trees again. And then they show us what looks to be a real forest that's been chopped down or torn down. Now take a look at this. It's footage of the first H-bomb test called Ivy Mike. Watch how it changes. That's a composite. Then it morphs into this. It looks like a completely separate explosion. Now take a look at the frame before the explosion and then the one after. These frames were cut together. Why? Then this frame was cut to this, which looks like the sun to me. It looks like they're zooming in on the sun. Maybe a composite because the clouds aren't moving. Then they introduced some sort of liquid. It looks like a laboratory concoction in composite with the sun. Next is Operation Dominic Fireballs in the Yukon. What does that look like to you? Watch it again. It's the sun. Now here's Operation Greenhouse. These guys are getting all ready to see what looks to be the sun again. The sun seems to start to expand. Maybe it's being zoomed in on. They worship the sun after all, Lucifer. So why wouldn't they use him as their greatest weapon? And who headed up the whole program? None other than J. Robert Oppenheimer of the Oppenheimer family, who is reputed to have been the original financiers who got the Rothschilds started in Frankfurt, Germany in the 18th century.
He should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
You're thinking, what about Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? Is that Hiroshima? That looks like Hiroshima, but it looks like it's been carpet bombed. Check out this image of Rotterdam. Was that a nuclear bomb? Now compare it to this image of Hiroshima. Actually, this isn't Hiroshima, it's Tokyo after firebombing in 1945. If you accept that FDR might have had foreknowledge of the bombing at Pearl Harbor, maybe you might want to leave room for the possibility that his propaganda machine might have created the myth of atomic bombs. There's no question that the powers that be have ballistics with tremendous explosive capacity. But this shot, for example, could easily be high-volume dynamite. And what are we looking at here? Take a look at this house again. Whatever was strong enough to blow it to smithereens wasn't strong enough to even shake the camera. And look how high up the camera position is. Are we looking at another model? Now look at this bus and this car. Whatever's blowing them up is not moving the camera. And this building seems to blow up from the inside. Everything gets blown every which way except for the camera. Except look in this shot, it seems to tilt up a little bit. Now this is one of my favorites. Watch the two guys behind the glass. Who's filming them? Isn't he being exposed to all that rocket fuel? Anyways, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. If you're hell-bent on believing that they can blow up the world at the push of a button, then go ahead. But next time you hear a politician justifying the invasion of a country based on the fact that they supposedly have weapons of mass destruction, realize that they're not only lying about the other country supposedly possessing weapons of mass destruction, they also may be lying about the very existence of weapons of mass destruction.
Do North Korea have nukes? Are the Iranians still trying to build a nuclear bomb? Are we perpetually on the brink of thermonuclear war? The governments and the elites that control them have such a history of lying to the public, can we not assume we are not being told the truth? From the Titanic to 9/11, the public have been fed one pantomime after another. Can we not be forgiven for questioning nuclear weapons, perhaps their tallest of tales? All this time has passed and still no nuclear war. This is excused with the notion of mutually assured destruction, the idea that all supposedly nuclear-armed nations fear their own nuclear destruction too much to try to destroy another, and so we live in perpetual nuclear peace in a world of continuous conventional war. What if all war was a fraud, the banking elite controlling all sides, all playing for a draw, not trying to defeat their enemy, but controlling their populations with fear? Why not forget the weapons and simulate it all on computers?
It's a bluff, John. Call it off. No, it's not a bluff. It's real.
Hello, General Barringer. Stephen Falcon.
Mr. Falcon, you picked a hell of a day for a visit.
General, what you see on these screens up here is a fantasy, a computer-enhanced hallucination. Those blips are not real missiles, they're phantoms.
Jack, there's nothing to indicate a simulation at all. Everything's working perfectly.
But does it make any sense?
Does what make any sense?
Wouldn't it be cheaper and easier to pretend? Why spend all that money on weapons you know you're never going to use? When convincing your enemy or your public you've got them achieves the same ends. Would the elites want to endanger themselves with nuclear weapons considering what they can supposedly do? Do they want to destroy the world, to hide underground in bunkers, or is that just what they want you to think? They haven't done it yet, and I wouldn't hold your breath. Why have lots of nukes pointed at each other? Why not just have one very big one each, powerful enough to destroy the world? Would it not offer the same protection? If nuclear weapons exist, why do they tell us? Why aren't they kept secret? Surely it would be the best way to prevent them from proliferating. They are so secretive about all their other weapon systems, like HARP, directed energy weapons, railguns and coil guns and rods of God or kinetic weapons. Real or not, nuclear weapons are weapons of propaganda, designed to fill the public with fear, through which the elites control the population of the world.
Is this a game, or is it real?
What's the difference?
Oh, wow.
German scientists had split the atom by bombarding uranium with neutrons, which caused instability in the uranium nucleus. During this split, mass was lost and was converted into kinetic energy. They had discovered fission, and with it, opened a Pandora's box.
If each of those neutrons goes into another uranium nucleus and causes fission, then the first fission has led to more than 2 fissions in the next generation, and you can see that each successive generation has many more neutrons, and this causes an explosive chain reaction.
If 2 masses of highly fissionable uranium in the form of a sphere and a plug could be brought together with sufficient speed inside a bomb, an exponentially increasing chain reaction with explosive force would result.
It was known that the nucleus of one form of uranium, isotope 235, would split when it absorbed a neutron. When this happened, energy was released and more neutrons were created that struck and split other nuclei. When it happens continuously, it's known as a chain reaction. No one knew at the start how much fissionable material was needed to support an explosive chain reaction. That volume would be known as the critical mass. Another element, only discovered in late 1941 by Berkeley nuclear chemist Glenn Seaborg, also had the properties to explode in a chain reaction.
And we immediately saw no one's mind was on anything but how can this be used for war? It gradually became clear. It's quite possible to make an explosion from this.
It was this concern that led refugee German physicist Leo Szilard to reveal that possibility to the U.S. government. Together with Albert Einstein and Edward Teller, he composed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. It told of a terrible possibility. Germany had the talent and the knowledge to research and develop an atomic weapon. Delivering the letter to Roosevelt on their behalf was economist Alexander Sachs, a friend of Szilard and economic advisor to the president.
Let's take a look at this letter. It may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. However, such bombs might very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air.
Major General Leslie R. Groves, the man responsible for the Pentagon, was placed in charge of the project.
The project was massive, to design and build a device that existed only in theory from material that didn't exist in any quantity under unprecedented secrecy.
Fermi tackled the first obstacle to the bomb, the question of whether or not a sustained chain reaction could be induced in a uranium reactor. Without the successively doubling power of the chain reaction, a bomb would be an impossibility.
Fermi was one of the few scientists who was talented both in theory and in practice. He loved getting his hands dirty. Leo Szilard was the antithesis of Enrico Fermi. Szilard usually slept late. He soaked in the bathtub to get fresh ideas.
While in the bathtub, Szilard remained focused on the competition, the German bomb effort. He convinced scientists in the U.S., whose community thrived on openness, to censor their own papers, so that they would not inadvertently help the Germans.
This would also facilitate the hoax. The nuclear bomb hoax thrives on secrecy, and in fact, one of its main purposes is to create an apparent need for extreme secrecy within the government and the industrial military complex. One of the main purposes for the creation of the myth of nuclear weapons is the rise of the secret services. Nuclear weapons provide a perfect excuse for governments to keep secrets and tell lies to their populations. As a result of the nuclear weapon myth, the population demand it. Without nuclear weapons, there is little or no justification for keeping secrets and telling lies to the population, or for the organizations charged with that task.
But sometimes we forget that security violations can be dangerous business too. If classified information about this test mission fell into enemy hands, the consequences could be disastrous to all of us, individually and collectively as a nation. Security is only common sense. Don't take chances. Avoid loose talk. Safeguard classified information. Report security violations at once. Prompt action may prevent a minor incident from developing into a serious one. Avoid writing about classified material in letters home. Be sure you're secure. Don't be careless.
I hate a careless man.
Strike them head on. Lord, they're turning the plane. Now the whole field's covered by the woods of the cars and gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
On August 14th, the Japanese government decides to accept the distasteful allied terms of unconditional surrender. Atomic warfare has made further resistance futile.
We aren't really sure what's happened. We're happy about the war ending, but I don't think everyone believes this thing about the atom bomb. I think it might be some kind of propaganda device that gives the Japanese a good excuse to surrender. Perhaps the Japanese said we dropped a bomb, and we're just going along with it. There aren't any big celebrations.
Now again, we now turn to Japan, and the first Portuguese ship blew into Nagasaki, And there, it was actually a storm blew them in, and they had Jesuits on board. And otherwise, it wouldn't have been for the storm, would have blown in. It was really kind of a bizarre story. But then the Jesuits made a very big stronghold in Nagasaki. Then they also made another one north of there in Hiroshima. And then the Japanese monarchy and the Buddhists realized after about 4 generations of what was going on, and that they were using this as a political means, not as that's where again is they weren't trying to get more people into Sunday Mass. That was not at all.
That's right.
They weren't. That was not the goal whatsoever. That was like a secondary type of thing. So the whole thing was political, and they superficially kicked out the Jesuits. They killed a bunch of them, but there was so much influence already at the time that it was already too late. And basically, it was more again of a gesture to do it more than really actually to do any type of purging. Had they had to really do a purge, they would have to kill thousands of Japanese and also all along the way. But they just took out maybe 30, 40 Jesuits, and basically the influence stayed there.
If I might humbly disagree with you on that, for the listener's sake, that I covered in my book, I showed that they did kill, I think, around 20 or 25 Jesuits. I think they crucified them, and it was just a public execution. But when Ieyasu expelled the Jesuits in 1614, that was considered final, but they ultimately had to do that nobody could come into Japan, I believe, around 1639. And the only ones they allowed to come to port in Japan were the Dutch Protestants because of Will Adams. And Will Adams was the English ship captain of a Dutch Protestant ship who warned the emperor of the Jesuits and who brought the British in to fight the Portuguese in a great big sea battle. And I believe about 30,000 Japanese were killed. So it was a big battle, and as far as I believe, it seems to me, the Jesuits were indeed kept out for about over 200 years until Commodore Perry and his gunboats come in 1854 and forcefully opened Japan to the British and to the Americans. And it's at that time that the Tokugawa shogunate is overthrown in 1867 because the Tokugawa shogunate was the abject enemy of the Jesuit order. They had to resign. They killed Emperor Komi because Emperor Komi was only 36 at the time, and he said, no white men are entering this country. We're not having any of these foreigners in here. And so he was assassinated, and they made his son, who was 14 years of age at the time, Emperor Meiji, and he ruled Japan for some 40 years. So based upon those things, I believe that Japan was a legitimate expulsion. And then look at the terrible punishment of the population of Japan during World War II. All the firebombing, the detonations of nuclear devices on the ground, I'd say. It was just a total destruction of their culture so it could be rebuilt into this commercial colony for the Jesuits.
Well, it's also, too, is that they resisted of doing any type of banking. As in versus out of China when they first came in, is that even though you had certain emperors coming through, there was still a lot of banking that was done through the Vatican system in China. Basically, they resisted this banking as much as possible in China, and I believe that was also one of the key things is why then, but they had enough influence, though, then to fearmonger with the Hirohito and the late 1800s, then to modernize per se and phase out the samurai as far as being military in Japan. And again, I believe that was a lot of it having to do, again, with if you look at the history of Jesuit influence of arming them. Now you had Japan set up. Basically, again, now the major influences of the Jesuits were Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Isn't that interesting? Is where, quote, the bombs, quote, went off. And we discussed this before. This is how much more we got here, a little bit. Is that we now have what we've discussed many times before, is that you had dirty bombs in the plains of the American plains.
Yes.
They dropped, and they had magnesium and they had uranium on the bombs themselves, but they made a kind of a big blast. But the actual mushroom cloud that we see today was actually a electromagnetic pulse device on the ground in the strongholds of Jesuit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and exploded upwards. You had 8 Jesuits near 8 blocks away from ground zero. They emerge out of a bunker, and they say, well, the reason was because we were praying to the Virgin Mary. That's right. Why we survived.
That's right. And even Malachi Martin mentions that in his book, The Jesuits, The Betrayal of the Catholic Church, how they emerged from ground zero unscathed, no radiation problem, and attributed to the miracle of the Virgin Mary. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and by the way, for this, the Pedro Arrupe, who was there overseeing it all, was made Jesuit general in 1965.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, it just keeps on going.
It is now 1938, at the brink of World War II, when he is unexpectedly assigned to become a missionary in Japan. Already multilingual, Arrupe dives into his study of Japanese and a lifelong mission of intercultural understanding.
I must say that at the time, I did not focus on the transcendent aspect of the missionary experience, but rather on certain negative personal aspects, the discovery of a reality different from what I expected, and above all, the feeling of loneliness. And I experienced an even greater loneliness when I went to Ubi, 21 hours by train from Tokyo, for my first mission assignment, although I spoke Japanese only very poorly. Another important personal event was my imprisonment for 1 month in Yamaguchi. Japan was at war and I was suspected of espionage. I spent days and nights in the December cold, entirely alone. Many were the things I learned during this time: the science of silence, of solitude, of severe and austere poverty, of inner dialogue with the guest of my soul.
August 6th, 1945, begins as an unremarkable morning for Arrupe and his young Jesuit students on the outskirts of Hiroshima. The hum of an approaching airplane does not seem particularly threatening. They're used to hearing armadas of bombers overhead. Today, there is no siren to raise the level of fear.
So on August 6, 1945, when the first atom bomb fell on Hiroshima, Arrupe and his group were just outside the city limits. They heard it, and everything flew apart in the house. They didn't know what it was.
The fate of Father Arrupe and his novices is later filmed for the record by the American government.
Between 0 Point and the main building of the novitiate of Jesuits was a hill which served to lessen the intensity of the blast. Yet, despite this protection, the glass in the doors of the main entrance foyer were shattered, and the paneled ceiling was blown loose by the force of the explosion occurring 4 miles away. A group of Jesuits who were teaching in Hiroshima witnessed and survived the explosion. One of them has provided an eyewitness account.
I am Father John Zenas, professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of Tokyo. It is under management of the Jesuit fathers.
What were you doing in Hiroshima at the time of the explosion?
Well, my philosophical class was evacuated from Tokyo to Hiroshima about 5 months ago, and I was staying with my class at a house of studies at the outskirts of the city of Hiroshima.
Could you describe exactly what happened in the morning of August the 6th?
I was in my room, which faces the valley, and suddenly I saw a light, like magnesium light, flashlight, which filled the whole valley. And looking out of my window to find out the reason for this peculiar phenomena, I saw nothing besides this light, and turning from the window to the door of my room, I heard a crash. It may have been 10 seconds after seeing the light, the flashlight. And immediately I was covered with splinters of the window frames and glass sticking into the walls and actually my flesh itself. After a while, we saw a procession of people coming from the outskirts of the city up the valley. many of them, most of them, were wounded, especially the parts of the body which were not covered by clothes, like hands, feet, back. They came up to our house, and we did what we could, but there were no possibility to give much of aid.
What is your opinion as to the story that the ruins of the city emit a deadly ray?
Well, I think that it's just a rumor. Because I myself and others of us have worked in the city itself immediately after the explosion for several hours, and we felt no ill effect at all.
In future years, Arupe would be called upon many times to tell his story, beginning immediately with U.S. newspaper reporters and military investigators.
What were you doing in Hiroshima at the time of the explosion?
Suddenly, we saw a blinding light, like a flash of magnesium. We heard a formidable explosion. After about 15 minutes, we noticed that in the direction of the city, dense smoke arose. We climbed a hill to get a better view. Before us was a decimated Hiroshima.
Father Arupe, he's been famous for that, for having been one of the witnesses of the falling of the first atomic bomb.
I shall never forget my first sight of what was the result of the atomic bomb.
I think it's fundamental. I begin my biography with the moment the bomb was dropped into Hiroshima, and he's there below. And the burst, the spiritual explosion that is produced in him at the moment he stops and sees the watchtower stop at 8:15. The tremendous energy that results helps cure 150 sick who show up at his hospital thanks to a bottle of boric acid that he finds.
Assuredly, it was in such moments of tragedy that we felt God most near to us.
And this seems to have marked him very much. A kind of feeling of having been close to the end of the world, to have been present to one of the most dramatic events of the history of mankind.
Oh, a parking ticket! I was gone 5 minutes! Oh, how could this day get any worse? Oh my God.
Another thing that people have taken as a given that seems to be, that could possibly be a complete fabrication. It might be another offshoot of this Mason's plan to just siphon off a bunch of money from the space program, but also siphon a bunch of money from the nuclear weapons program, because it seems like, and this was only brought to my attention through you and your post about it and the footage that you've shown, it seems like at least the test footage that we've seen of a lot of nuclear weapons from back in the day when they're telling our parents to duck and cover under their school desk to protect them from a nuclear blast, and you got the air raid sirens going off. Obviously, our entire culture was completely paralyzed by the idea of nuclear weapons. But when you're looking at the test footage, given back then it might not have looked fake. You know, back then they actually thought King Kong looked real in the movie, or Jaws looked real in the movie, but now we can see it's clearly fake. When you look back at that footage, it's oftentimes, it looks like the scale of, say, a subdivision where you're in an empty lot across the street aiming a camera at a farmhouse on the other side of the street, a lot over, and then the blast hits and the farmhouse just gets destroyed. The house just gets ripped apart. But what happened to the camera? You know, who's filming that? The camera is only a couple 100 feet away from that. And in some videos, man, this is the most compelling, is the blast comes from behind the camera. What the hell is that? The blast comes from behind the camera and the house gets blown away out into the background of the shot. And you're like, what kind of camera in that day and age could survive that blast, but an entire building can't? I mean, it seems way out there. You've changed my mind on a little of this. You dipped my needle further into the fringe for sure.
Yeah. So it's just another way to get us scared into giving them more money. So we're giving them hundreds of billions of dollars in this space race that America and Russia were doing, and they also did the Cold War, so they scared us into this nuclear scare and then stole a bunch more money to build fake nuclear weapons. And so yeah, the nuclear weapons don't exist as such. The tests that you've seen, the very early ones like you were talking about, are clearly fake, just done on models. Some of the later tests were done using stacked dynamite. You just get a shitload of dynamite and blow it all up, and it makes the mushroom cloud, does the whole thing. And what they'd do is they'd tell one team that, they'd have a bunch of people 20 miles away, say army guys watching, doing the test, and then you've got over on one island these people stacking dynamite, saying that we're doing this for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be over on that island. Meanwhile, they got another team over on that island stacking dynamite for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be on the other island. So they even have military men stacking dynamite that they know is being used for these supposed nuclear explosions, but they believe that they've seen a real nuke, even though they tell them to cover your eyes and put your head in your laps as it happens. You don't see anything until the smoke clears afterwards. But yeah, a lot of military men will swear, up and down that nukes must exist because they were there at some of those tests, and it's just dynamite. They do it beneath water by stacking dynamite in submarines, and you can do it up in the air as well. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki nukes, you can see that they're clearly two superimposed explosions, one on top of each other. There's two smoke plumes made to look like they're one. I actually used this technique several times. If you look at this nuke footage, there's if you go to my website, Nuclear Weapons Do Not Exist, you'll see these 3 documentaries that expose the thing completely. And so not only do so for instance, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what happened is that they were firebombed. So the cities were leveled just like Tokyo was firebombed, and the damage is comparable. But they claim that it all happened from one blast. But this is clearly not true, because flowers and plants started growing within a month, and they say nuclear radiation would exist for hundreds, thousands of years and would cause birth defects and everything. But nowadays, Hiroshima's a bustling city. Everyone's living there. Everything's growing there. Radiation's not a problem. There is some radiation after any explosion, so you would be able to go there with a Geiger counter and get some radiation, especially right afterwards, but it dies down quite quickly. And nuclear power, one of the most prominent nuclear physicists in America, he's dead now, Galen Windsor. He was involved in setting up most of the nuclear power plants in America. And he went all over America for years giving this lecture about how nuclear power is just the most expensive and effective way to boil water. And they're essentially steam plants, and that's all it is. The nuclear component that supposedly causes all this radioactive waste that needs to be, hazmat dealt with, and they drill holes into bedrock and put the nuclear waste deep under the earth, and they've got all these crazy regulations. He says, when we were first working with nuclear material, uranium, plutonium, we held it in our hands, and if some of it got hot, we'd throw it in the water, and that was it. No problem. He said, I would bathe, I would swim in the pool there that we would throw the radiated metals into, no problem. People thought he was crazy. He started drinking a glass of water from it every day, no problems. And then in his lecture, he started eating radioactive waste. So you can see on YouTube, type in Galen Windsor, and he'll take out a Geiger counter, show you some radioactive material. He'll take it out of a tube, and they'll say, I've just caused an EPA, if the EPA was in here, we'd have to clear out this whole area for half a mile, and people would have to come in with hazmat suits, blah, blah, and then he puts it back in the tube, and there's some left over on his hand. So then he licks his hand, shows the waste on his tongue, swallows it, and says, I've been doing this for years. And so the idea is just another fear campaign. And that's why they get the military involved in all these nuclear power plants and the nuclear weapons. It's to siphon off money, keep us afraid, and keep us playing off one another. Everybody thinks that, you know, Russia and America are enemies and that the Cold War is real and the space race is real, but it's all just, you know, they're all like WWE. It's like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man. You know, they're all paid by Vince McMahon. They all go out to eat together. You know, if you're high up in politics anywhere, for sure you're part of this brotherhood that controls everything. There's no independent man at the head of any state. And if he was, what's he doing? The only type of government that should exist is a government that doesn't tax or perform violence on its people. So the only kind of candidate I would vote for is someone who's for the abolition of all taxes and legislation other than common law. If you hurt or harm a person or their property, theft, or breach of contract, those three things, those common laws, are the only things anyone should ever have to go to court for. Everything else is a victimless crime, and this is the big system that they get us caught up in. So they've got millions of statutes and acts that supposedly ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if you break any of these millions of legislations, they've got reasons to fine you or kidnap you and put you in jail, or even murder you if you don't pay them up. So I don't vote. I don't recommend voting. If you could get out of paying taxes, I'd recommend that too.
Wow. Well, man, this has been super fascinating. Doing a show like this once a week, sometimes it gets pretty hard to rattle me, pretty hard to get me excited for a topic, but this has done it.
Though plutonium may exist in theory, it is likely that it can only be produced in trace quantities and not in sufficient quantity or purity to establish what its attributes are, nor in that which would be required for a bomb. The qualities of plutonium are highly convenient. Not only is it highly fissionable, but also castable and machinable. These qualities were improved by alloying plutonium with gallium, though other elements were tried. Gallium also supposedly lowers the susceptibility of plutonium to corrosion.
The isotope we produced was plutonium-238, produced by the deuteron bombardment of uranium. Then a month later, joined by Emilio Segre, we identified in this room the isotope of importance, plutonium-239, and isolated it so that it could be have its fission properties measured at the 37-inch cyclotron.
But Hanford depended as much on chemical separation as it did on the reactors. The chemistry was Glenn Seaborg's, massively scaled up from his University of Chicago team's ultra-microchemical work.
We had been working with what you call tracer amounts, invisible amounts, detected by its radioactivity. But we couldn't deduce the chemical properties with certainty that way. We needed to work with actual ponderable, weighable amounts. And that's why we produced weighable amounts of plutonium in this way. This meant that we had to work, I say we, are the chemists working with me, on what they call an ultra-microchemical scale.
Scientists and dignitaries awaited the detonation of the first atomic bomb in a desolate area of the New Mexico desert, known aptly as Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death. They had taken bets on how much power their creation might unleash, but many wondered whether the weapon would work at all.
But as the test date drew closer, there was a nagging uncertainty about whether the bomb would actually work at all.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1...
Despite the uncertainty and the doubts, the implosion device worked first time. With all the technical difficulty they admit to in making such a device, we do not expect a good few failures before you got it right. Of course, it worked first time because they faked it. As with all subsequent nuclear tests, it was fake.
5:30 a.m., July 16th, 1945. The world entered the atomic age. With an intense flash, a sudden wave of heat, followed by a tremendous shock wave. The ball of fire extended 40,000 feet. The bomb packed a punch equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The bomb packed a punch equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, completely vaporizing the steel tower.
Later in the morning, Fermi and physicist Herbert Anderson donned white surgical scrubs and rode in 2 lead-lined tanks to ground zero. Fermi's tank broke down after only a mile, and he had to walk back.
Is there any reason they didn't want Fermi to see the evidence firsthand?
Radiated dust and debris from the blast, fallout, would fall onto neighboring communities. At a few locations, detectors showed rises in radioactivity, but they dropped quickly.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The explosions were mostly created using large towers of hundreds of tons of TNT. A short time before the Trinity test, they detonated such a tower of 108 tons of TNT. The Trinity test was probably a larger such tower, of 1,018 tons of TNT.
May 1945. The hot New Mexico desert seemed far from the ravages of war in Europe.
The trick relies on encouraging people to believe a big explosion is a massive one. With eyewitnesses, this is achieved through distance. From a distance, it is difficult to know how big an explosion is. Most will accept it as being as big as they are told it is. It was very big after all. The trick also relies on people's propensity to exaggerate when recalling experience. It would have been the biggest explosion any of them had ever seen, and so they are likely to tell anyone who asks that it was big, in fact very big. They are unlikely to play it down and say, well, it wasn't all that big actually. For many of them it would have been the most interesting thing that had ever happened in their lives, and so they would tend to big it up.
In order to accurately calibrate the instrumentation for the test, another test, one using only high explosives, was needed. A dress rehearsal of 100 tons of TNT was planned for. Hundreds of crates of high explosives were stacked on the platform of a 20-foot tower. Tubes of low-level nuclear material were scattered throughout the explosives to simulate the radioactive products of a nuclear blast. Everything was set to a scale to match the expected effects of the nuclear test shot. On May 7th, the high explosive was detonated. The orange fireball was seen 60 miles away.
How big is this explosion? How big you perceive it to be depends very much on how far you think it is away and what you have to compare it to. The myth of the blinding light that supposedly makes nuclear bombs distinct from conventional ones is achieved using floodlighting and possibly mirrors, and possibly through the burning of elements such as magnesium within the explosion itself. It is often illustrated to the public with shots of extreme shadowing, which can easily be created in a studio. Most witnesses will never actually see the supposed blinding light, as they were usually told to close and cover their eyes, and often to turn their backs. Often the illusion was reinforced with protective goggles and clothing. The footage is generally put together using footage of smaller explosions, without anything in shot to provide size comparison, mixed with footage of the sun, sunsets, and clouds filmed using time-lapse photography. There is little or no unedited footage provided to the public. Almost all of the footage has cuts, and often cuts away to shots of observers, or shots illustrating the supposed destructive force, and back again to the footage of the developing aftermath of the explosion, and then away again and back again. And so, the public rarely sees a so-called nuclear explosion complete in one continuous sequence. Mushroom clouds are not unique to so-called nuclear explosions. The illusion of nuclear weapons was also manufactured with the use of very large conventional bombs, fuel air bombs or thermobaric or vacuum bombs. Up close and from a distance, they could easily be mistaken for mythical, much larger so-called nuclear bombs.
But it was one unique conventional bomb that was the climax of high explosives in Vietnam. Called Big Blue 82, it was a blockbuster that caused injuries for miles. At 15,000 pounds, a single bomb was the entire cargo for the journey into hostile airspace. Delivered from the hold of a C-130 cargo plane, the bomb was slowed by a parachute and drifted to its target. When it exploded, the crater was enormous, and the destruction total.
Russian military has announced the testing of a vacuum explosive device that unleashes a shockwave with the power of a nuclear weapon, according to Russian scientists. U.S. forces have used a thermobaric bomb, which works on similar principles, in their campaign against al-Qaeda and Taliban forces.
The first and most obvious question people ask when confronted with the idea that nuclear weapons may be a hoax is, what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
While the scientists at Trinity Site waited for the test in the New Mexico desert, the primary components of the gun-type uranium weapon were being hoisted aboard the cruiser Indianapolis. The ship set sail for the Pacific island of Tinian in the Marianas. A few weeks later, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off in the early morning hours. Just after 8 a.m., it dropped the weapon named Little Boy, which exploded approximately 1,000 feet over the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Boom!
The uranium gun weapon, or Little Boy bomb, was a simple design, and scientists were confident it would work without testing.
Designers considered a test prior to combat use unnecessary and impossible, since there was only enough U-235 for one bomb.
And so Little Boy goes into combat as an untested weapon.
In the past 24 hours, 4 heavily loaded B-29s have crashed on takeoff. Parsons' greatest nightmare is the catastrophic consequences of a similar crash, this time with a fully armed atomic bomb on board. Disregarding months of planning, he makes a last-minute decision to attempt the arming of the bomb in the air and not on the ground, something which has never been tried outside the controlled, sterile environment of the laboratory. Armed with just a screwdriver and a spanner, he spends hour after hour practicing the techniques required to arm the bomb in flight. The temperature inside the bomb bay soars to over 40 degrees, but he continues, even as his hands start to bleed. There is no room for error. The next time he does this will be for real, 31,000 feet up in the sky, exactly 2 hours away from the target.
This is padding the narrative in order to make the very dull story of dropping a bomb more exciting, and to sculpt it into a triumph against the odds. The footage of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima appears to be 2 plumes of smoke filmed in such a way as to make it look like one larger plume of smoke.
"8:18. My God, what have we done?"
The damage to Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not consistent with one single blast. The damage is uniform. Wooden structures have been burned away. More substantial buildings remain, with roofs and other flammable parts burned. It is remarkably similar to the damage caused by conventional firebombing. In Hamburg, Darmstadt, Kassel, and most notably Dresden, firebombing was used in such a way as to create an effect known as a firestorm, where a fire attains such intensity that it creates a central column of rising hot air, inducing strong inward winds which supply oxygen to the fire, which significantly increases combustion. The better comparison to make is with Tokyo, where the construction of buildings was more comparable, and conventional firebombing led to a similar death toll, casualty figures, and damage. Japanese cities consisted mostly of wooden dwellings and burned easily. Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Tokyo were destroyed by fire. This is not in dispute. It is claimed that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that a singular atom bomb caused these fires. It is likely that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were firebombed in much the same way as Tokyo, and that the story of Little Boy and Fat Man is entirely fictional.
At 8:15 in the morning of August 6, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target. The bomb was aimed to explode above 0 point, a spot in the city at the junction of the Motoiso and Ota rivers. The bomb was intentionally set to explode well above the 0 point to dissipate its radioactivity. Here is the pictorial record of the result. At 0 point, directly beneath the explosion, the soldier in the scene is pointing at the spot from which all damage to the surrounding area was measured in terms of distance from the center of the blast. Within a mile of 0 point, the devastation speaks for itself. But in these very ruins, Army cameramen have found and filmed pictorial evidence that tells in twisted steel and stone the effect of death-dealing atomic power. For example, this was the site of the main Japanese military headquarters. There were approximately 20,000 Japanese military personnel stationed here. They are among the missing. A lone concrete smokestack indicates where a bustling factory once stood. Reinforced concrete buildings seem to have withstood the explosion fairly well, the damage varying with their distance from 0 point. Within an area of a mile to a mile and a half, this type of building was the only type to withstand complete demolition and destruction. Here's a building that was actually knocked sidewise, giving you an idea of the force of the blast. The direction of the blast is graphically told by the slant of this parapet, a concrete wall. Etched in the stone base of what was the Russo-Japanese War Memorial are telltale lines, atomic handwriting for all to read. Another signpost of the direction and force of the explosion is blasted in the polished granite base of this statue. The light surface indicates the angle of the blast, 2/10 of a mile from 0 point. Many of the shattered windows pointed like skeleton fingers the direction of the atomic wind of death. On one side, blown in. On the other, blown out, with atomic tornado force. Inside, the flash burns on the chairs give eloquent testimony on the heat of the blast a mile from 0 point, which singed the mohair upholstery like a blowtorch. Hiroshima City Hall, which stood at an angle of 45 degrees to the direction of the explosion, had its doors and windows blown in, but suffered much less damage than buildings squarely in the path of the blast. The windows and doors offer mute evidence of the way the blast swept into the structures. The destructive circle within a mile from 0 point had a few notable exceptions, mainly reinforced concrete. On the edge of the area of greatest damage was a landmark, the Red Cross Hospital, which never ceased functioning, although it sustained damage. Today, it dominates the desert of a debris that was Hiroshima. Another notable exception to the general demolition was the Higashi Railroad Station in East Hiroshima, a mile and a half from the center of the blast. This building, however, suffered extensive damage. The twisted steel beams and concrete wall show the effects of the tremendous concussion. What's left of the Commercial Museum, within 0.2 of a mile of 0 point also gives indication of the tremendous push of the explosion. The downward force of the blast turned the roof of the commercial museum into a reservoir. Amazingly enough, bridges did not suffer too badly at Hiroshima. This steel rail bridge, 1 mile from 0 point, had the side toward the explosion virtually blasted by flying particles, which removed almost all the paint. But the side away from the explosion did not need a new paint job. Roads in the area fared better than buildings or bridges. Shortly after the fires died down, traffic was resumed. Today, these highways through the ruins are again in use. Beside our military traffic trudge the survivors of vanished Hiroshima, the first city in history to be atom-bombed into oblivion.
It would be easy to ensure the bomber crews responsible for the firebombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't survive the war. And it would be easy to convince people to lie, with bribes and with the idea that it is a noble lie that would bring an end. Where is the big black scorch mark we saw from the bird's eye view of the Trinity site? It's all so much more dramatic when you add dramatic music.
Although Trinity had been a success, questions remained about Fat Man.
Three days later, another mission carrying the plutonium implosion weapon named Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki.
Cue the dramatic music. Hopefully by now you're beginning to see this for what it is, pure Hollywood.
The uranium gun weapon, or little boy bomb, was detonated over Hiroshima at an altitude of 1,800 feet, the height to achieve maximum blast effect. 3 days later, the Fat Man implosion bomb was detonated over Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, 70,000 people were killed or listed as missing. Of its 90,000 buildings, over 60,000 were demolished. The implosion bomb, dropped on Nagasaki, took the lives of 42,000 people and injured 40,000 more. It destroyed 39% of all the buildings in the city. With a yield of 20 kilotons, similar to that of Trinity, this weapon would be considered a nominal atomic bomb and provide a blueprint for all future nuclear weapons.
These skulls in the foreground are very illustrative. Throw in a nice emotive baby playing in the rubble. Burn victims are in no way evidence of nuclear detonation. Standard heat will cause burns. Burn victims are indicative of firebombing. Radiation is also not proof of nuclear detonation. Radiation can easily be faked. It merely needs to be claimed. But as we have seen from the TNT test at Los Alamos, Radioactive material can be spread by conventional explosives, and so presumably conventional bombs. However, there is no significant evidence of any long-term radiological contamination of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Baker, a much bigger explosion, was probably large amounts of submerged explosives. Soon enough, the Soviets would begin to build their own fake nuclear bombs. August 29th, 1949. The Soviets faked their first atomic bomb. Making a device that will cause a nuclear explosion is one thing. Making deliverable nuclear bombs is a further challenge. Mass manufacturing these devices so that they can be stockpiled, ready for use as and when needed, brings with it further difficulty. It is not denied that nuclear weapons have a lifespan. This is good for the industry, as the need for periodical replacement generates ongoing revenue.
I'm Galen Windsor, and I thought I'd share a few hands-on practical things that have to do with this nuclear scare scam. Now, you've heard that gamma energy, the kind of energy that comes off a rock like this, is the most penetrating, most damaging of all radiation. And not only that, here is uranium, the parent of radon, and they say if you can detect radon in a home, then it's bad. If you exceed the EPA's limit, it's reason to run you out of your home. Spend $13,000 like they did with Stanley Watrous' house in Pennsylvania the other day to get rid of the radon, to ventilate it out through. Ridiculous. Let's take them one at a time. This is a rock that I picked up in Natarita, Colorado. 16% weight uranium. High-grade uranium. Hot. I read a thing the other day that says they had high-grade uranium, and lo and behold, it's too hot to transport, so they had to bury it on site. Oh, wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about radiation. If we can, yeah, are we picking up? If you put the probe right there, the meter goes off scale, and you can hear it, all right? Hot. Radiation, gamma radiation, is the most penetrating of all radiation. Oh, is it? All it's got between the rock and the probe is my hand. Doesn't count so pretty much, does it? What if I put the rock behind me? You don't suppose they've been lying to you, do you? I suspect they have. Well, let's do a little bit more. I got a black bottle. Good stuff comes in white bottle. A bottle of no-dose. You can send children down to the drugstore to buy no-dose. All they need is money. In this are 660 white caffeine pellets. And this one is uranium oxide, U3O8. You can't buy it for love nor money. The state of Washington sent 2 of their Gestapo agents over to my home to confiscate my uranium samples on the 17th of December last year. Got a challenge. I'd like to have somebody in the room volunteer to take all of this bottle or all of this bottle. The only thing that I'll tell you is that one of them won't hurt you and the other one will kill you. Do you want the white stuff or the black stuff? White stuff? You do. There's enough in there to kill 4 men your size. the government says we got to ban this material. It's radioactive. Let's check it in the bottom of the bottle. Not very radioactive. Let's take the cap off. Oh goodness, very radioactive. This instrument will only count gamma, energy. It's just energy. Light's coming from those lights, only you're getting lots of infrared from the lights as well as ultraviolet. Energy response, and it's very carefully damped to only discriminated so it only gets the energy that comes from this. I don't want it to respond to a light, just to this. Cost me $1,000 to get an instrument that will just respond to this and not to that. This is radioactive by any definition. Radioactive material giving off radiation that is read by an instrument like this. The daughter of this, radon, cannot be read on this instrument because it gives off alpha particles. An alpha particle is a dye-positive particle that comes from the nucleus. It has 2 protons and 2 neutrons, therefore an atomic weight of 4, and it's minus 2 electrons. And if you grab it with a high ionization potential counter, it'll count. But if it travels 2 inches in air or through a piece of paper, it picks up 2 electrons, 2 beta particles, if you will, and becomes helium gas, and it won't count on an ionization chamber. Did you know that this thing right here is giving off helium gas? Alpha comes from uranium. Okay, radioactive material. You pour it out in the hand, and that's radioactive contamination. Is it radioactive? Yeah, it is. Very radioactive. Now, decontamination is nothing but scooping it back up and putting it into the bottle. I just now decontaminated my hand. No, I didn't do such a good job. Not good at all. Is it still radioactive? Yeah, that's called residual radioactivity. Now, under the decontamination rules of the government, when you decontaminate somebody like this that's that contaminated, and this is certainly a reportable incident under current DOE regulations, when you decontaminate him, it has to go down a controlled drain so that you don't disperse radioactivity. Do I qualify as a controlled drain? That material that I just ate is not soluble in body fluids. Like it's been this. It was fired originally at 940 degrees C, where it becomes U3O8, known in the industry as HCl insoluble. In other words, it will not dissolve in concentrated hydrochloric acid, hot. Your stomach has 10th normal hydrochloric acid in it, so it won't even dissolve. The stuff is so fine that it has no texture to it. Doesn't even feel rough. So it's tasteless, odorless, has no texture. How's it supposed to hurt me? Because I've been eating this on lecture tour for 2 years, the state of Washington felt it necessary to confiscate my uranium samples so that I would be safe. Dr. Fulton from the Hanford Environmental Health Foundation called up and he says, "Hey, I heard one of your guys OD'd on uranium today, Galen." And we talked for a little while and he says, "Oh, that was you." And I says, "Listen, I can eat all that stuff I want." He says, "It'll ruin your kidneys." "How are your kidneys?" "They're fine." "Well, you should have been chelated within 4 hours. And I mean, you guys are going to follow me around the country and give me chelating agents every 4 hours after I eat it on lecture tour?" He says, "We'll give you any medical assistance that you need, Galen. We don't want anything to happen to you." I said, "Did that include turning out the federal SWAT team 4 days ago to get me?" Where are these guys coming from? Well, here's a piece of metal. Density of 19, 19.0. If you know your chemistry and physics, you know that there are only two metals that have that density, plutonium and uranium. Radioactive, pyrophoric, density of 19. Outside of a laboratory, most of you can't tell me whether this is uranium, plutonium, or a mixture of the two. Now, I said that it's heavy, and it is. Let's see if it's radioactive. Yeah, it is. Pyrophoric, what does that mean? Pyro, fire. Black on the end. The spark that just came off there is pyro, fire, burn. If it's plutonium, I just contaminated this area of Arizona in excess of the EPA's limit for 1 square mile of surface. Somebody laughed. It's serious. The end of progress altogether says that I just contaminated you in excess of the limit for 1 square mile. It's now silver on the end. Tomorrow it'll be black because it self-oxidizes, this black color like this, all by itself. Plutonium does that and uranium does that. Is it hazardous? Yeah, it is, because they take depleted uranium metal and make it into 50 caliber bullets, fire them from shoulder-held weapons. In 1976, they obsoleted tank warfare with these things because it only takes one dog face with one weapon to knock out a 65-ton tank. It'll go through 3 inches of armor plate, and when it comes out the other side, it's that white hot spark that we just made. And the 5 men in that tank are dead, because it'll burn all of the oxygen out of the air and burn their flesh. 1976, they obsoleted tank warfare, and you never even knew that. They make 10,000 of those bullets every day in the United States. We got enough in arsenal to sink all of Russia's tanks, and our boys in the Defense Department don't even talk about it. Yeah, it's hazardous to your health. Reminds me, lead is hazardous to your health too, isn't it? Particularly if it's in a 45 slug like this and it hits you right here going about 2,600 feet per second. It's not the material, it's the impact from the velocity. Let's be very specific in the words that we use. This particular chunk of lead came out of a human body. My son, who's a deputy sheriff, thought maybe I could use it on tour. That's called dying of lead poisoning. Anything less is a figment of the imagination because it's not soluble in body fluid either. This is a pellet of cobalt-59. If you put it in a reactor into a neutron field, you can convert cobalt-59 to cobalt-60, which gives off a gamma. It becomes the source that doctors use to irradiate patients to 7,000 Roentgen for one patient. The total dose absorbed by radiation workers at 3 Mile Island in the last 6 years is something like 1,500 Roentgen. 5 times more given to a single individual in a doctor's facility. Now, do you know why I say that the federal regulations are absurd? And if you live by those federal regulations, maybe you're being absurd too? This same material that's labeled high-level waste by our current government, our current Congress. Now, plutonium is an interesting chemical element. It is created in a nuclear reactor. The Manhattan Project built 8 of these reactors at Hanford. The first one took 12 months from sagebrush to nuclear steam to build, and it had never been done in that size before. How could they do that? Why did they do it? To create this element called plutonium. Plutonium has been assessed as being the most hazardous material on Earth. Now, from the standpoint that you can make an atomic weapon out of it, yes, it is quite hazardous, because a piece of it that big, 2.5 kilograms, that's only 5 pounds, is the force that delivered 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent over Nagasaki. Indeed, it is hazardous. The one over Hiroshima that had fully enriched U-235 in it was 5 times as big. So plutonium is more dangerous than U-235, is it not? By a factor of 5. It takes 5 times as much U-235 as it does plutonium. Therefore, it is the most hazardous thing. Enter the great pretenders. They said that 5 grams of plutonium, properly distributed over the face of the Earth, would kill everybody on Earth. Now, if you can only get one 20-kiloton weapon to go on 2,500 grams, how's 5 grams going to kill everybody on Earth? Early on, I had a fear that said, if there is this much fissile material, that can undergo a chain reaction, we called it in the beginning, then if you set a match to it, all the fissile material in the world is just going to keep right on going. Totally unfounded fear. It turns out that when you're in this business of recovering plutonium, like we recovered so much of it at Hanford, we found out that if you have it in a solution where it's less than 5% plutonium, it won't go critical any way that you kick it. And when you get it to 100% plutonium, you better be careful. Because if you put it in more than a 5-inch diameter cylinder, you're playing with fire. You can undergo what is known as an uncontrolled criticality, accidental criticality. The air turns blue. If the cylinder is sealed, it will explode from steam pressure. And that steam pressure builds up in a millisecond, which is about that long. No, you don't horse with it. And then you find out that those 8-foot thick shielding walls on those canyons were put there because they didn't know how much was a critical mass. They says, if we make a mistake, we don't want to die, so we will provide the shielding. And so this shielding thing started for no other reason than they didn't know what was a critical mass. Well, through the years, we got pretty good at telling what a critical mass was. And I have worked in a plant where I had half a critical mass in this hand, barehanded, dressed in street clothes, half in this hand, wearing a lab coat, and I'd put this half in a pocket on this side and this half in a pocket on this side and walk down the hall. If those two ever got together, there would be a blue flash. They never got together because I was in between them. And we do that every day. And each half had to meet definite dimension characteristics. And so we'd take them down and pass them one half at a time, and they'd measure it and say, yeah, that one will pass, and then we'd pass them the other half, and that one will pass too, but they were carefully put in separate bird cages so they couldn't get together accidentally. Well, those of us who worked with it enjoyed it. We knew what we were doing. We worked at it. When the President of the United States decided not to operate that fuel reprocessing plant, I started scrambling to find out what was going on. Many things had been done in the name of health and safety. Don't get burned. You got to have a safety record. You have to be safer than anybody else. We were already safer than anybody in the whole world. Well, you can't afford to get burned with this. You've got to enforce the limits. You've got to keep it. And I says, hey, that's not what the ball game is at all. I'll bet you the ball game is something else. And in 1982, when the Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, a guy by the name of Mo Udall, I don't know whether you people in Arizona have ever heard of him or not, authored that bill. It's called the High-Level Waste Disposal Act of 1982. The material he called waste is the reusable uranium fuel that I had been working on for 32 years. Needless to say, Mo Udall and I do not agree on whether that material is waste or not. The name of the game then is, who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? The government says bury it 3,000 feet deep in basalt, and we'll hold a contest among the states to see who gets to bury it. Oh? Why do you want to bury it? Did you ask the owners? Who is the owner of the plutonium? May I submit that it's most likely the nuclear power ratepayer. He is paid for the mining, the fabrication of the parent uranium, power generation, and is being charged in advance for its burial. If you're paying for it, to whom does it belong? How much is it worth? In inflated dollars, a ton of reusable uranium fuel contains useful metal isotopes worth upwards of $10 million a ton. Mo Udall says it's high-level waste. The value of reusable uranium fuel scheduled for permanent disposal probably exceeds the national debt. Naturally occurring plutonium quantities, and you know plutonium does occur naturally. Plutonium-244 is found at the residual activities of the several, 8 at least, Oklo phenomenon reactors across the world. First one found at Gabon, Africa. Naturally occurring plutonium quantities have been enhanced by transmutation of uranium. That's the reason we built reactors in the first place. Our ability to detect and measure emissions from these elements is useful in inventory control. When fissile elements, fissile isotopes, are present at less than 5 weight percent, plutonium-239 equivalent, and the heavy metal oxide matrix is stored dry in air, it has no critical mass. Remember we talked about shielding was because they didn't know what a critical mass was? If it is light water reactor fuel at less than 5% equivalent fissile content, you can handle it, you can do anything you want with it, you can stack it up, you can have a room full, you can have a handful. As long as you keep it dry, it will not sustain a chain reaction. What then is all this falderall about a little bit, 5 grams will kill everybody in the world? They don't know what they're talking about. And when they say that, they're thumbing their nose at measurement experts like Galen Windsor. I am insulted when they say those things and get away with it because it has no bearing on the truth. It cannot be mishandled. It will not expose any person to an unshielded nuclear reaction. In other words, no controls are necessary except to prevent the pilferage of the inventory. Have you got that one? Let it register. Do you need governmental rules and regulations and instructions? No way. Then why do we have all of those rules? Inventory control practices capitalized on the fear of undereducated masses who work in the industry, I didn't say anything about ordinary people now. I'm talking about the people who have worked in the industry and those who cast stones from without. The Ralph Naders, the Jane Fondas. Now, it doesn't take you much thinking to find out that maybe the industry is the source of the problem. The industry is the one that made up the committees that made the rules that the Congress enforced. You ever thought of it that way? The strangest kind of feather bedding that's ever been dreamed up, it makes the railroad engineers look like pikers. The only amounts of fissile process materials that are of health concern to the handlers are those that can accidentally cause an unshielded nuclear chain reaction, or that will cause erythema from the shortest wavelength, highest frequency, and therefore the most easily shielded ultraviolet light emissions of the electromagnetic spectrum. Big words. Let's see what they mean. The emissions from uranium, plutonium, cesium, all of those things are only important if you assemble an amount that if you get this amount and this amount together, it can go critical. You can get a blue flash and therefore get burned. And that's happened 34 times in the business, and 8 men have died as a result of that. Accidental criticality. Documented in Los Alamos document 3611, if you want to check the source. Or if you've got enough of it together that it's giving off ultraviolet light of this particular wavelength and frequency without any intervening shielding, enough to burn you, sunburn you, erythema, reddening of the skin. If it's less than that, if the effect is less than that, then what is the problem? Excessive government regulation. That's what's the problem. Why then are we still playing this game that any amount of this material is of hazard? Reusable uranium fuel, which has been isotopically enhanced in power-producing reactors, is a valuable national resource, not a high-level waste. The utility operators recognize the future worth of this commodity. Mo Udall, in that Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, imposed a tribute of $1 per kilowatt hour, $1 per megawatt hour on all electricity produced in a nuclear plant so that they can research and develop methods to throw it away. Why do the utilities willingly pay this amount to the Secretary of Energy? To limit their liability exposure. Who pays that amount anyway? The consumer of nuclear generated power. You have no choice, and therefore I call it a tribute. At the same time, they have provided their own storage basins at these reactors at ratepayers' expense to retain ownership control of the plutonium resource. So you consumer, you ratepayer, you taxpayer are paying for the storage of this fuel, and WNP2 at Hanford has storage that will take them through the turn of the century, and yet every day they are paying a tribute to the Secretary of Energy with the concurrence of the United States Congress and signed by the President of the United States in 1982, 83. Who was that? Ronald Reagan. They have provided those storage basins at ratepayer expense to retain ownership control of the plutonium resource. I started playing a game one day, 7 years ago. I says, okay, Portland General Electric, you've got the Trojan reactor, you've got a storage basin problem, I'm going to make you an offer. I made them an offer that says I will take all of your spent fuel, FOB your basin, if you will give it to me. In other words, I will take it off your hands at no expense to you. I will ship it, I will store it, I will do everything that needs to be done to that fuel. And you know what they told me? Can I quote them? Go to hell, Galen Windsor. We value it more valuable than platinum or gold. We're going to play the plutonium futures ourselves. Now, where did I learn that the name of the game is who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? The first plutonium I saw was in a glass tube on the newsreel when I got back from the Pacific in 1946. And that they had in a glass test tube, they said, was worth $500,000. Certainly they had less than 5 grams of plutonium in that tube. That's pretty expensive stuff. And so for the show, they put a pot underneath it in case they dropped it. They said, we don't want to have to pick it up out of the rug. When it was decided for us not to operate this plant, plutonium was guaranteed on buyback by the federal government at $43 a gram. That's quite a price drop, don't you think? When that price guarantee went away in October of 1971, the price of plutonium became $10 a gram. It steadily went down to where its present worth on the market is a minus $2 a gram per year. That's what it costs you to hold on to a plutonium inventory on a material that has been declared worthless by the utility owners and rubber stamped by the Congress of the United States, and they're spending billions of dollars digging holes in ordinary rock so that they can throw it away, dispose of it. Okay, what are you going to do with it? Reusable uranium fuel may be properly stored in air-cooled, dry storage in a cost-effective manner. Nukem in Germany offers this immediate and long-term option as a necessary and safe step prior to reprocessing. They're doing it in Europe. At least 4 regionally located facilities are available in the United States where this concept can be used right now. Barnwell Nuclear Fuel Plant in South Carolina, Midwest Fuel Recovery Plant in Morris, Illinois, this one, Nuclear Fuel Services in upstate New York, and Redox Processing Plant at Hanford, Washington. These fully shielded, already radioactively contaminated storage areas have secure, limited access. All have been operated under processing conditions of 10 CFR 50, and the MFRP has a 10 CFR 70 storage license, the only licensed storage facility away from a reactor in the United States. It singly, all by itself, is capable of storing all of the reusable uranium fuel that needs to be moved away from power reactors for the remainder of this century. We had that storage designed in 1975. Had the approval of the design. Why then are you spending money over here in New Mexico on the waste isolation project? Why are you spending money at Hanford at the basalt waste isolation project? Why are you spending money at Beatty, Nevada for storage when I can already store it in this building that's already built? I just named you 3 others that can do the job all by themselves too, and I know where there's 14 more buildings that can do it. What are we going to do? Redox and other excess facilities at Hanford are capable of dry storing all commercial REF until plutonium recycle, at least through 5% enrichment, is reestablished, or until the 22nd century, whichever comes first. RUF can be cost-effectively stored in existing facilities. Where does Mo Udall came off then, saying that you cannot use this plant for its intended purpose unless it is owned by the United States government. He has said that. The waste isolation projects are politically mandated wasting of national energy and construction resources. Plutonium proliferation by diversion of stored reusable uranium fuel is of minor importance compared to global availability of fully enriched uranium by laser isotopic separation. Let me explain that last thing that I said. Jimmy Carter said you can't ship plutonium to India, but in the same paragraph said you may ship them fully enriched uranium. Oh, Jimmy Carter, that peanut brain, what did he just say? He says that when the Israelis took out the reactor in Iraq, they had fully enriched uranium from France. And they says those rascals, those Iraqis, are going to take that fully enriched uranium, put it in that reactor, irradiate it to plutonium, and therefore have to recover the plutonium in a plant like this, and we stopped them when the fully enriched uranium makes a better weapon than the plutonium in the first place. Now, when the President of the United States says things like that, and when the press gives it credibility, I get insulted. And right after I get insulted, I get angry. And I've been angry for quite a while now. And finally, one day, I said, my own personal security is not important. I think I'll go tell this tale. All I want is to tell my story. The commodity that I communicate is called truth. And so then I ask you a question, a very brief, pointed question. Who owns the plutonium and how much is it worth? And then I'm going to attach on to that a question I want you to think about till we talk again. If you haven't been burned by this particular source of radiation, what is your problem? You obviously have one. Otherwise, you would join with me in telling the truth about this particular commodity. And so yes, I'm recruiting helpers. What happened to the guys who taught me the business? Thousands of them. The hands-on business. Where are they? They're still there. Why don't they talk? Who are the they that say this is the way the business is going to be run, whether it makes sense or not?
We're back with Galen Windsor, and we're talking about the nuclear scare scam. Galen, it seems to me that from what I've heard you say that the scaring of the people is better than a lock and key to keep this stuff out of the hands of those who might be interested in investigating and keeping this valuable material hidden for just an elite few.
This is probably the way that it works best. And so then the secret was to keep from letting other people know that it could be handled, because first of all, we weren't accepted by the community, and the materials that we were working with, they feared, but there were certain few people that realized its real worth, its potential to be used in ways other than to support our national defense.
Let me ask you a question, Galen. Are you worried about do you have reason to be worried about your personal safety? Because the kind of people that you're describing here are powerful people. I wonder if you're still around. I wonder how much longer we can expect you to be in this game.
Well, on the 13th of December last year, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Region 5, turned out a federal SWAT team to get me on a federal warrant issued by Bob Thomas out of Walnut Creek, California. It was kind of funny in a way. They turned out this federal SWAT team at Hanford, and they had my picture, and alongside it says, "This is an irrational individual. He poses a threat to our security. Take him at any cost." Now, the reason that I'm still here only has one logical conclusion. I have lots of help.
Well, you've told us about how that you and others of your friends and colleagues have handled many times this so-called deadly nuclear energy material that the whole world is so scared of. Why weren't you afraid of it?
Because we did silly things like recover some of the undissolved fuel elements out of the redox dissolver that burned a hole in it. And we went in and sampled these things by remote process. We got it out into our hands and found out that we could walk around the lab with them barehanded and they wouldn't hurt us. And we were standing there in the lab tossing them back and forth. Uranium metal that wouldn't dissolve in the boiling nitric acid. Well, if you find out that you can play with it, and it was only 90 days since that thing came out of the reactor and it doesn't burn you, why should you be afraid of it?
So in other words, you're telling me that you learned to not be afraid of it because of practical use and application and hands-on experience.
Hands-on. We might even been playing games.
Okay, you say that you swam in this water that was straight from spent fuel used to cool that fuel, and
Yes.
you swam in it.
Yep.
You told me earlier that you went a little bit beyond that. Would you share a little bit of that story?
Well, swimming in it didn't have the desired effect. So I decided I had to be more direct with these people that were giving me trouble. They were kind of hard to teach, so I went to drinking a glass of it a day. I had the bottle of it. Last time I went swimming, I filled this 2-liter bottle with water and washed it off on the outside in the shower when I washed me off on the outside so that we didn't tattletale. You know, radioactive material is just a trace or a tattletale. So you got to get it off so they won't know that you've been swimming in the pool and drinking the water. So I took this bottle in and set it on my desk. And who would suspect that the manager of safety and analytical service had a bottle of spent fuel pool water sitting on his desk, and he drank a glass of it every day.
This was unheard of.
Nobody ever did that crazy stunt before.
How has that affected you, Galen?
Well, as near as I can tell, it made me about 6'4" in my cowboy boots, 210 pounds, and really quite a nice fellow.
All right. What then happened as a result of your doing this strange experiment on your desk with this water? What was the result?
Can corporations have a heart attack? I think General Electric had one, because after they ran me through a whole body gamma scan in December of 1974, by the time I got out, because I had a plutonium lung burden and it took 45 minutes to an hour to count that, everybody on site knew that the manager of safety had been swimming and drinking in the swimming pool, the spent fuel storage pool. Had cesium-137 at a ferociously high level. It even exceeded the NRC's limit. And I'd been drinking it. They knew the fat was in the fire. Now, where do we go from here? Well, first of all, I got a poison pen letter from the people in San Jose. And he says, "Thou shalt not do those things. They'll find out that the inventory can be stolen." Well, that didn't sit very well with this cowboy, because nobody tells me what to do, particularly when what I do is right and hasn't harmed me. Who are they to tell me what I want to do? What I'm saying to you is that the federal regulations are absurd. The congressman that put them into place ought to be fired. They ought to be sent home. The regulators, what do you do with them? Quit paying them. The taxpayer, the electorate, elects those people to go out and do a job. Why do you continue to pay them when they're teaching you baloney, when they're putting in regulations that don't make any sense. Cut it out. Quit paying them, fire them, send them home. The term I grew up with says can them. Is it easy? Apparently not. You haven't got the job done. The majority of the Congress is irresponsible, amoral, atheistic, irresponsible. Let's see, how many more adjectives can I drum up? But that many. Let me tell you. We as the people sent a bunch of rascals out to the energy store with a signed blank check. And we say, hey fellows, if you run out of money, just go build us a good power plant. If you run out of money, come back and we'll give you another signed blank check and guarantee the payment out of the ratepayer's pocket. I found out that it doesn't hurt me. You need to find out that it doesn't hurt me or you. In fact, the only reason for the existence of these big transcontinent distribution lines would be if they could compete with a small mass-produced reactor sitting in your backyard. Why don't they want you to? Because they are the federal energy cartel. They like to set the price, the total availability, and whether you can hook onto it, and if you don't pay your bill, cut you off. That's called power, domain, and control. And they like that. They do not want you to be energy independent. If you had one of these sitting in every 10-block area in Phoenix, you could tell the rest of the world to go get lost. Oh, there's another use for that heat. You could heat your homes in the wintertime, or you could cool them in the summertime with it. Heating, ventilation, air conditioning, they call it, HVAC. In countries where it freezes, you could run that hot water out and chase the frost away in the spring and in the fall. And they found out that plants grow faster in warm water anyway, so you'd irrigate with it all summer. We got troubles in this country. I'm telling you what the problem is. Doing something about it, responsibility is yours.